Here, read this.
Woof.
Hello everybody, Ash here from the Read This podcast, back with another video about Shakespeare's history plays. Today I'm going to focus on one aspect of the history plays I find really interesting, and that is the changing nature of prophecy and magic in the plays. We're going to be looking at the plays in King order, which is the order in which I've made podcasts on all of these plays we'll be talking about. You can find links to them in the episode description box below. Now, we're all familiar with the feeling that what was satire 20 years ago is now our day-to-day reality. What I find interesting about what Shakespeare does with prophecy in particular in the history plays is plays out a dynamic that's quite similar. So to go through the plays in King order, in Richard II, we hear of prophecy a couple of times. John of Gaunt, on his deathbed, effectively, says,
"Since I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring, do foretell of him. His rash, fierce blaze of riot cannot last, for violent fires soon burn out themselves."
Now, I'm going to put this in the category called pragmatic or sensible prophecy, i.e. someone saying, you're a nightmare, I predict that things will not go well for you. This is not included in magical prophecy, which we will see a bit more of later on. The other reference to prophecy comes when we meet a Welsh captain.
"The bay trees in our country are all withered, and meteors fright the fixed stars of heaven. The pale-faced moon looks bloody on the earth, and lean-looked prophets whisper fearful change." Again, he is somewhat proven in his hunch, but he sounds a little bit credulous. And given how Shakespeare treats the Welsh later on, in fact, in the next play, we could put this down to the Welsh being, people from the wood, being maybe a bit swayed by the legacy of people like Merlin, and giving up based on portents that have no real influence on reality. By the end of Richard II, of course, Richard has been usurped. Despite what he said, the anointed balm has been washed off a king, and Bolingbroke, that is the future Henry IV, takes the throne. Now, moving on to Henry IV Part 1. Again, we hear prophecy from the mouths of the Welsh. It's Glendower this time, who is criticised by Hotspur. "I cannot choose. Sometimes he angers me by telling me of the mould warp and the ant. And such a deal of scamble stuff was puts me from my feet. I tell you what."
Another reference to Merlin, another sort of sense that the Welsh are kind of credulous and full of scamble stuff. They're poo-pooed, basically. But Hotspur, when he later meets his doom at the Bottle of Shrewsbury, mentions prophecy again. He says,
"Cold hand of death lies on my tongue. No mercy, thou art dust and food. Oh."
he would prophesy, but he runs out of breath, basically, which we could see as, hard reality once again triumphing over the scamble stuff of prophecy. So again, nothing in Henry IV Part 1 that is explicitly supernatural. We move on to Part 2, and in the start of a running theme, we have the current king referencing a prophecy that the old king made. This is Henry IV saying that Richard once said,
"When Richard, with his eye brimful of tears, then checked and rated by Northumberland, did speak these words, now proved a prophecy. Northumberland, thou ladder by the which my cousin Bolingbroke ascends my throne."
But again, we can put this into the category of, pragmatic or sensible prophecy. Richard is just saying the obvious. He's looking at a bad situation and going, this isn't going to turn out well. Moving on, a much later reference to prophecy also comes from Henry IV and regards himself. And this is actually based on, I believe, what was found in the Chronicles, that Henry IV, it was said in a prophecy, would die in Jerusalem. but he ends up dying in the Jerusalem chamber instead. When you read that in the Chronicles, it sounds kind of like, oh, what a strange coincidence. When we see it in the play, of course, Henry acknowledges the coincidence, and we might even say that he decides he will die in the Jerusalem chamber to kind of reference the prophecy. So again, we'd be pushing it to say that this is anything supernatural, but crucially, we do have someone performing a prophecy. Henry IV noticing that he is fulfilling a prophecy himself.
It hath been prophesied to me many years I should not die, but in Jerusalem.
So that comes to the end of Henry IV. Henry V takes his son takes the throne. His own play is the only play where prophecy isn't mentioned at all. There is a reference to witchcraft, but it is all to do with the bewitching allure of his princess, Kate. But we will hear in the next play that a couple of prophecies were made during Henry's reign, one of which will be by himself. But the first one we hear goes as follows.
And I fear that fatal prophecy, that in the time of Henry named the fifth was in the mouth of every sucking babe, that Henry born at Monmouth should win all, and Henry born at Windsor lose all.
Now we are, of course, jumping onto the next king, but we are jumping backwards in time in terms of Shakespeare's composition. He wrote the plays we've just talked about much later. Henry VI, Part 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III were written towards the start of his career. So we are earlier in Shakespeare's chronology, sequentially later in King chronology. And Henry VI Part 1 is a step towards the weird. We have Joan of Arc, who has a spirit of deep prophecy. She is openly called a prophetess, and she also communes with spirits.
Now help, ye charming spells and periapts, and ye choice spirits that admonish me, appear and aid me in this enterprise. Now, ye familiar spirits that are called out of the powerful regions under earth, help me this once, that France may get the field. Oh, hold me not with silence over long.
Now, most productions do what you've just seen and have her, abandoned by her spirits, as she is, with her reacting to nothing, indicating that her spirits or whatever her supernatural counselors are one of her own invention, just in her imagination. But they are actually referred to in the script. In Act 5, Scene 3, Joan comes on and addresses her spirits. There is a crash of thunder, and we see enter fiends. They are described as fiends. They don't say anything. They walk and speak not, according to the stage directions. Then they hang their heads after Joan has implored at them a bit more. They shake their heads, and then they depart. The stage directions don't necessarily imply that Shakespeare or the production is saying that the spirits actually exist. It could simply be theatre. We chose to represent Joan of Arc's fantasies. But in depicting the supernatural in such a way, does change the tone of events elsewhere in the play. So, for example, in the temple garden scene, Warwick makes what we've been calling a sensible prophecy.
And here I prophesy. This brawl today, grown to this faction in the temple garden, shall send between the red rose and the white 1,000 souls to death and deadly night.
But now, since we're cutting from England to France and, seeing a bit of Joan of Arc, seeing a bit of the ongoing hostilities brewing in England, talk of prophecy is now slightly more charged than it was. In Richard II's day, prophecy seemed a bit silly, seemed a bit credulous, was associated with the Welsh. Now, when someone makes a prophecy, we associate it not with Merlin and skimble-scamble stuff, but with the figure of Joan of Arc, someone who is described by believers as a prophetess and who is seen on stage with non-human entities. In Henry VI Part 2, we have a similar scene, and probably the most outrageous so far depiction of the supernatural. It involves the Duchess of Gloucester, the Lady Cobham, who gets involved with a kind of spiritual conspiracy in which she hires a wizard and Marjorie Jourdain, a witch, to basically make predictions for her, tell her what is going to happen, what is the fate of a few of the nobles around her. Marjorie Jourdain summons a spirit, and then the spirit answers questions.
First of the king, what shall of him become?
The Duke yet lives, that Henry shall depose.
Once again, in the script, the spirit is credited, listed as a character called Spirit. Once again, there is thunder. Thunder and lightens terribly. Then the spirit riseth. In Jane Howell's production, Marjorie is sort of possessed by the spirit and takes the spirit's lines.
Let him shun castles.
So important to note that the script is deadpan about this being a spirit talking. Next, we come to its prediction. So the first prediction is that there will be a violent death for either the Duke of York or Henry VI. The wording is a little bit unclear. We can't be quite certain of which one the spirit's referring to, but since both the Duke of York and Henry VI meet violent deaths, chalk one up for the spirit. The second prediction is that the Duke of Suffolk will die by water, and sure enough, later in this play, he is beheaded at sea by pirates. And the final prediction concerns the Duke of Somerset. The spirit says, "Let him shun castles, safer shall he be upon the sandy plains than where castles mounted stand." Now, later on in the play, he is killed by the Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III, under an alehouse poultry sign, and the alehouse is called the Castle. Richard sort of gloats over his body.
For underneath an alehouse poultry sign, the castle in St. Albans, Somerset hath made the wizard famous in his death.
Richard's way of showing for the first time that he knows the value of making a good prophecy come true. So what do we conclude from that? Either are there a bunch of charlatans who got lucky? Yeah, maybe you could say the Duke of York and Henry VI will meet a violent death. Maybe you could say politically that was quite likely. But three in a row, it's like, if you think about it in terms of scratch cards, that's pushing it a bit to say, you could have guessed all that. So we're left with the uneasy conclusion that there was something supernatural involved there, that was a genuine prediction. It came out too well for there to be another explanation. So we're beginning to see that now, that having lost Henry V, having fallen into disorder and chaos and uncertainty with the ineffectual Henry VI at the throne, that something that used to be the subject of ridicule, prophecy, is suddenly tangible fact. We are in that situation of what used to be satire is now our reality. Moving on to part 3, we don't have a moment that matches with either Joan's spirits or Marjorie Jourdain, and the spirit predicting the fates of those aristocrats and the king. But we do have one striking, blinding, if you like, unexplainable moment. It's when the sons of York, Edward, Clarence and Richard, Edward, George and Richard, I always call him Clarence like it's his first name, he's the Duke of Clarence. They are together when they suddenly see 3 suns in the sky. It's good pathetic fallacy, that, isn't it? 3 suns seeing 3 suns and taking it as a good omen. But they do, there's no indication that they're making it up. They're reacting to it live, so it's not like one of these moments which retrospectively gets fiddled with. It would be odd for them spontaneously to sort of make up the fact that they were looking at 3 suns. It's not exactly prophecy, but still worth a mention, I think, in terms of unexplainable phenomena. Moving on, Henry VI, when he is murdered by Richard, prophesies.
And thus I prophesy. Many a thousand which now mistrust no parcel of my fear, and many an old man's sigh, and many a widow's, and many an orphan's water-standing eye. Men for their sons, wives for their husbands, orphans for their parents' timeless death, shall rue the hour that ever thou wast born.
Moving on to his own play, when England is at her lowest ebb with the tyrant Richard III at the throne, this is the play with the most mentions of the word prophecy. Richard puts about false prophecies. Margaret, who's still alive, grieving and isolated, is referred to as a prophetess. The difference is Richard's prophecies are things he then sets out to achieve. You know, they are kind of rigged in that sense, whereas Margaret predicts events that she herself has no influence over. More than once, she predicts the fate of certain characters who later say, "Oh, Margaret was right."
Oh, Margaret. Margaret. Now thy heavy curse is lighted on poor Hastings' wretched head.
But Richard is unsettled when he remembers that Henry made a prophecy in his own reign. We return to that theme of one king remembering a prophecy that the last one made. So Henry prophesied that Richmond, the future Henry VII, would be king.
Do you remember me? Henry VI did prophesy that Richmond should be king when Richmond was a little peevish boy.
And later, before they meet at the Battle of Bosworth, we have this extraordinary scene where Richard and Richmond, the future Henry VII, are asleep, and ghosts of Richard's murdered victims appear to both of them. They deliver a warning and a curse to Richard, and then their blessing to Richmond. Now, Richard and Richmond wake up separately, one well rested, saying he slept like a king. Other one, Richard, thrown into almost like an identity crisis by how bad a nightmare that was. Individually, they think their dreams are self-contained, but we, the audience, have seen that the ghosts were actually organising that scene. They were the ones moving between Richard and Richmond, which, right at the end of this whole series of plays, is the most strikingly and emphatically supernatural moment. I really like how Jane Howells, again, her production of Richard III sort of leans into this whole theme of prophecy, ending the whole tetralogy with this extraordinary image of Margaret kind of crowing over the body of Richard III, almost like a sorceress who's got her way at last. Anyway, there is a brief history of how prophecy is used throughout the history plays. Set history too much there. Of course, I'm not necessarily saying that this was something that Shakespeare had mapped out and that he was going to try and enact this whole, what used to be satire becomes reality type thing out or anything like that. You could argue witchcraft was very popular on stage, and maybe he used a bit more of it in his earlier days when he was less confident as a playwright, because he knew it would sell tickets. Dr. Faustus, it worked for Dr. Faustus and Marlowe, so why not chuck a little bit in to Henry VI Part 1 and 2? But yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. This has just been a very glancing overview. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Give it a like and a subscribe if you did. I'll be back in a few days with another video, but until next time, happy reading.